She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman whose beauty became legendary, whose intelligence shaped empires, and whose love affairs changed the course of history. She spoke 9 languages, commanded armies, seduced the most powerful men in Rome, and nearly conquered the ancient world. Her name was Cleopatra VII, and though history remembers her as a seductress, the truth is far more complex and fascinating. This is the real story of Cleopatra, the queen who refused to surrender her kingdom and became immortal in the process. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE in Alexandria, Egypt, into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries since the time of Alexander the Great. Contrary to popular belief, Cleopatra was not ethnically Egyptian, but Macedonian Greek. However, she was the first of her dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language and embrace Egyptian culture, which made her beloved by her subjects in a way her predecessors never were. Her father was Ptolemy XIII, known as Auletes, or the flute player, a weak and unpopular king who spent much of his reign trying to maintain his throne through bribes to Rome. Egypt, once the greatest civilization on earth, had become a client state of the rising Roman Republic, dependent on Roman goodwill for its survival. Young Cleopatra grew up watching her father humiliate himself before Roman senators, and she learned a crucial lesson. Egypt's only hope for independence lay in manipulating Rome's internal conflicts. Cleopatra received an extraordinary education. She studied mathematics, philosophy, oratory, and astronomy. Ancient sources tell us she spoke Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Parthian, and several other languages fluently. She could debate philosophy with scholars and negotiate trade agreements with merchants. She understood economics, military strategy, and the complex web of Mediterranean politics. This intellectual brilliance, more than her physical beauty, would become her greatest weapon. When Ptolemy XIV died in 51 BCE, he left his throne to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she was required to marry according to Egyptian custom. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a disturbing tradition of sibling marriage to keep power within the family, and Cleopatra found herself married to a child who was also her co-ruler. In reality, Ptolemy XIII was controlled by 3 powerful advisors who had no intention of letting a young woman actually rule Egypt. For 3 years, Cleopatra struggled against these advisors, but by 48 BCE, they had succeeded in driving her from Alexandria. She fled to Syria, where she began raising an army to reclaim her throne. Egypt stood on the brink of civil war between the young queen and her brother's regents. It was at this moment that fate, in the form of Julius Caesar, arrived in Egypt. Caesar had been pursuing his rival Pompey the Great across the Mediterranean in Rome's own civil war. When Pompey fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary, Ptolemy XIII's advisors made a calculated decision. They murdered Pompey and presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift, hoping to win the Roman general's favor. But Caesar was horrified rather than pleased. Pompey had been his son-in-law, and this dishonorable murder offended Caesar's sense of dignity. Cleopatra, camped outside Alexandria with her army, saw an opportunity. She needed to meet Caesar before her brother's advisors could poison him against her, but the palace was heavily guarded, so she devised one of history's most famous stratagems. She had herself wrapped in a carpet or bedroll, and her loyal servant Apollodoros smuggled her past the guards and unrolled her at Caesar's feet. Imagine Caesar's surprise when a carpet delivered to his quarters suddenly revealed a beautiful, intelligent young woman who began speaking to him in perfect Latin, explaining the political situation with clarity and wit. Cleopatra was 21 years old, and Caesar was 52, but the attraction was immediate and mutual. It was not just physical. Caesar, one of history's greatest minds, had finally met a woman who was his intellectual equal, someone who could discuss politics, philosophy, and strategy at his level. Caesar sided with Cleopatra against her brother, leading to the Alexandrian War. Ptolemy XIII's forces besieged Caesar and Cleopatra in the palace quarter of Alexandria. During this siege, part of the famous Library of Alexandria was burned, a tragic loss of ancient knowledge. But Caesar and Cleopatra prevailed. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while fleeing the final battle, and Cleopatra was restored to the throne, this time married to her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, another child who posed no threat to her actual power. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, and she soon gave birth to a son whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, though everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. This child represented Cleopatra's greatest ambition, a union between Egypt and Rome, with her son as the bridge between two worlds. She even traveled to Rome with Caesar, living in his villa across the Tiber, scandalizing Roman society with her foreign ways and her obvious influence over their greatest general. But Roman senators feared Caesar's growing power and his relationship with an Eastern queen. They remembered how Alexander the Great had been seduced by Eastern luxury and had tried to make himself a god-king. They worried Caesar would do the same, especially with Cleopatra whispering in his ear. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, their fears drove them to action. A group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius stabbed Caesar to death in the Senate chamber. Cleopatra was still in Rome when Caesar was murdered. She fled back to Egypt with Caesarion, her dreams of a Roman-Egyptian empire shattered. But she was a survivor, and she immediately began planning her next move. Rome descended into another civil war, this time between Caesar's assassins and his supporters, led by Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. After the assassins were defeated at Philippi, the Roman world was divided between Antony, who took the eastern provinces, and Octavian, who controlled the west. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus in 41 BCE, ostensibly to answer questions about her loyalty during the civil war, but really because he needed Egypt's vast wealth to fund his planned campaign against Parthia. Cleopatra knew this meeting would determine Egypt's fate, so she staged an entrance that would become legendary. She sailed up the river to Tarsus in a barge with purple sails, gilded stern, and silver oars. She reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, while beautiful attendants dressed as sea nymphs fanned her and played music. The scent of perfumes drifted from the ship across the water. It was pure theatre, designed to overwhelm Antony's senses and present Cleopatra not as a supplicant but as a goddess. The strategy worked perfectly. Antony was captivated. Unlike Caesar, who had been Cleopatra's intellectual match, Antony was more straightforward, a soldier who loved pleasure and spectacle. But he was also generous, charismatic, and genuinely fond of Egyptian culture. Where Romans typically viewed Egypt as decadent and inferior, Antony appreciated its ancient wisdom and sophistication. He and Cleopatra formed a genuine partnership, both political and romantic. They spent the winter of 4140 BCE together in Alexandria, living in legendary luxury. They formed a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to surpassing all others in the magnificence of their feasts and entertainments. Ancient sources describe banquets where the floors were covered knee-deep in roses, where the rarest delicacies from across the world were served, where entertainment was provided by the greatest artists of the age. But this was not mere hedonism. Cleopatra was cementing her alliance with the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman world. She bore Antony twins, whom they named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, sun and moon. When Antony returned to his duties, Cleopatra waited patiently in Egypt, managing her kingdom with the same intelligence and efficiency she had always shown. For several years, Antony tried to maintain his position in Rome, while also pursuing his Eastern ambitions. He even married Octavian's sister Octavia in a political alliance. But he could not stay away from Cleopatra and Egypt. In 37 BCE, he returned to her, and this time their partnership became more formalized and more threatening to Rome. Antony began giving Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children. He declared Caesarion the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, implicitly challenging Octavian's claim to be Caesar's heir. The relationship between Antony and Octavian deteriorated into open hostility. Octavian launched a brilliant propaganda campaign against Antony, portraying him as a man bewitched by an Eastern sorceress, a Roman general who had abandoned his duties and his culture for the decadent pleasures of Egypt. He called Cleopatra a whore, a witch, a threat to Roman values and Roman power. The propaganda was so effective that it has colored perceptions of Cleopatra for 2,000 years. In 32 BCE, Octavian declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, a clever move that allowed him to frame the conflict as Rome defending itself against a foreign threat rather than another civil war. Antony, forced to choose between Rome and Cleopatra, chose Cleopatra. Together they assembled a massive fleet and army to face Octavian's forces. The decisive battle came on September 2nd, 31st BCE at Actium off the western coast of Greece. It was a naval engagement, and Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of over 200 warships. But Octavian's Admiral Agrippa was a tactical genius, and many of Antony's allies were unreliable. In the midst of the battle, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke away and fled. Antony, seeing her ships departing, abandoned his own forces and followed her. Why did Cleopatra flee? Ancient sources claim she panicked or betrayed Antony, but modern historians suggest she may have been trying to preserve her fleet for a later defense of Egypt, or that she and Antony had agreed on this strategy if the battle turned against them. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. Antony's remaining forces surrendered, and he and Cleopatra returned to Egypt to face the inevitable Roman invasion. For nearly a year, they prepared Alexandria's defenses and tried to negotiate with Octavian. But the future emperor wanted unconditional surrender. He wanted Cleopatra's treasure to pay his soldiers, and he wanted Egypt itself as his personal province. In August of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces entered Alexandria. Antony, receiving false news that Cleopatra had killed herself, fell on his sword. He was carried, dying, to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where he died in her arms. Cleopatra was now Octavian's prisoner. He wanted to parade her through Rome in his triumph, to display the conquered Eastern queen in chains as proof of his victory. But Cleopatra had one final card to play. She would not give Octavian that satisfaction. On August 12, 30th BCE, Cleopatra killed herself. The method has been debated for centuries. Ancient sources claim she used an asp, a poisonous snake, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. Modern scholars suggest she may have used a poison she had tested on prisoners, seeking the quickest and least painful death. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 22 years, longer than any pharaoh in centuries. She had borne 4 children to 2 of Rome's most powerful men. She had commanded armies, managed an economy, and nearly changed the course of history. Octavian had her buried beside Antony, and then he had Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, hunted down and killed. He could not allow any rival to his claim as Caesar's heir to survive. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a Roman province, and 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization came to an end. Octavian became Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and he ensured that history would remember Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress rather than the brilliant, capable ruler she actually was. For 2 millennia, she has been portrayed as a woman who used sex to manipulate men, when the truth is she used intelligence, political acumen, and yes, charm, to try to preserve her kingdom's independence against impossible odds. Cleopatra was not a perfect ruler. She was ruthless when necessary, having her own siblings killed to secure her power. She lived in extraordinary luxury while many of her subjects struggled. But she was also a capable administrator who kept Egypt prosperous, a polyglot who could speak to her subjects in their own language, and a woman who refused to accept the subordinate role that both Egyptian tradition and Roman prejudice tried to force upon her. She played the greatest game of thrones in history, and though she ultimately lost, she did so on her own terms, choosing death over humiliation. That final act of defiance ensured that Cleopatra would be remembered forever, not as Octavian's captive, but as Egypt's last great queen.